On several occasions, Dave Ramsey has made a faulty analysis regarding a Roth versus traditional retirement account. In this video, I'm going to show where Dave comes to the wrong conclusion that the Roth has an inherent mathematical superiority over the traditional account. I call this bad analysis the Roth superiority fallacy, and it's important that you understand it because choosing between Roth and traditional could have a big impact on your financial future. Dave's not going to be there to help you if you make the wrong choice. This is about you and your situation. The Roth might be the right account for you, but it's not because it has some built-in mathematical advantage. So let's check out this clip from the Dave Ramsey show where he took a call from a viewer, and this is what Dave had to say.
In order for the traditional to work out ahead of the Roth mathematically, you have to be in a lower tax bracket dramatically at retirement than you are now. A dramatically lower tax bracket, which, by the way, means you haven't got any money.
So there you have it. Dave unequivocally says you have to be in a dramatically lower tax bracket for a traditional IRA to work out better mathematically. He's very passionate about it. But he's wrong. There is no mathematical advantage to a Roth IRA if all things are equal. In fact, if you use the same tax rates and the same investment growth factors, the Roth and the traditional are mathematically equal. I'll show you the numbers in just a bit, but I want to continue with the clip from Dave because he's going to dig the hole even deeper with an example, and I'm going to use that same example to show that the Roth and traditional work out exactly the same way when you actually analyze the numbers.
Because if you've got $5 million, your required minimum distributions at 70.5 are going to put you in the same tax bracket you're in now. So you're not going to be in a lower tax bracket. And so the Roth absolutely mathematically kicks the traditional's butt. And here's why. If you take $200 a month from age 25 to age 65, 40 years, and you invest that in a decent growth stock mutual fund, you're going to have $2.5 million in there. However, only $96,000 of the $2.5 million is actual principal that you put in. So if you did a traditional in that, you would have gotten a tax break on $96,000. You would have not paid taxes yet on $96,000, but you'll pay taxes on the entire $2.5 million as you pull it out. If instead you did this with a Roth, you would pay taxes on the $96,000 and zero taxes on the rest of the $2.5 million. So there's no way that the traditional even comes close to the Roth mathematically.
Okay, so let's list out what Dave just said, and then I'll check the logic for each of these points. Point one, Dave says if you invest $200 a month for 40 years, you will end up with $2.5 million. Point two, Dave says with a traditional account, you defer paying tax on the $96,000 of contributions, but eventually pay tax on the full $2.5 million. And point three, Dave says that with a Roth, you pay tax on the $96,000 and then pay no tax at all on the $2.5 million. And point four, Dave says the Roth kicks butt. There is no way the traditional comes close to the Roth mathematically. And as I'll show, that right there is the Roth superiority fallacy. So before I go through each of these points, let's just use an arbitrary tax rate of 20% for everything going forward. It really doesn't matter what rate we use as long as we use the same rate to get a valid comparison. And 20% is easy to work with. I know it's not a real tax rate, but we just need something that's consistent to do our comparison. Okay, let's start with point one. And what Dave has set up here is what financial people call an annuity. And the formula for an annuity is on screen here. So if I plug Dave's numbers in, I find out that you need to assume about a 12.2% annual rate of return. And then the numbers work out fine, exactly like Dave says. So don't worry too much about the details and the math. It's on the screen, but suffice to say, all of this works out to match Dave's scenario. So moving on to point two, Dave says with a traditional account, you will defer taxes on $96,000 as the money goes in, and you'll pay tax on the full $2.5 million when it comes out. And this is correct. A traditional account allows you to defer the taxes at time of contribution and then requires you to pay the tax at time of withdrawal. So no problem with point number 2. Everything checks out fine. For point 3, Dave says with the Roth IRA, you will pay tax on the $96,000 as it goes in, and then the full amount comes out tax-free. Now he's pretty sloppy with his numbers here because he says you'll have 2.5 million, but you would actually have less. And the reason is that to be a fair comparison, you would have to make the Roth contributions using what's left of the $200 after taxes. So using our assumed 20% tax rate, that would mean you have $160 to put into the Roth each month. Now, Dave does try to explain this away later in his show by saying the psychology of money just has people put the same amount into a traditional or a Roth. So if you're putting $200 in a traditional, you would just put $200 in a Roth instead, and it would feel the same. But that's no way to do financial analysis. You can't compare two investments by saying, well, investment A is better than investment B, but you're putting more into investment A. It just doesn't make any sense. And if you put the same amount into a Roth and a traditional, then you are putting more money into the Roth because you have to put that money in after taxes. So it's going to cost you more than $200 to put $200 into that account. So if we plug in the numbers for the Roth into the same formula that we use for the traditional account, but we use the corrected value of $160 a month for the Roth instead of the $200, we find out that you'll end up with about $2 million as opposed to the $2.5 million you would have in the traditional account. Okay, so point 3 after this correction is that you would pay tax on the $96,000 as it goes in, and then you will have roughly $2 million ending amount, and that amount will come out tax-free. And now with point 4, we get to the Roth superiority fallacy. Dave says, basically, you would be a fool to pay tax on $2.5 million using the traditional account when you could have just paid tax on the $96,000 using the Roth account. And this resonates with people because when you phrase it that way, almost anyone would say, well, yeah, of course, I'd rather pay tax on the smaller amount. In this case, the much smaller amount of $96,000 versus $2.5 million. But that's the Roth superiority fallacy. If we assume the same 20% tax rate and go back to our traditional account, which ended up with $2.5 million, and we apply that 20% tax rate to it, then after tax, we end up with the exact same $2 million that we ended up with the Roth. So Roth and traditional, when all things are the same, end up with the exact same mathematical result. It would be easy to let the Roth superiority fallacy influence your decision because it is true that with the Roth, you pay tax on a smaller amount and you pay less total tax. But the math shows it doesn't matter. The end result comes out exactly the same because the traditional will grow to a larger pre-tax amount. And we can see this by just realizing that all of our calculations just boil down to this. We're taking 3 values, your investment amount, a growth factor, and the tax effect. And with the traditional, we arrange them like this. We say you take your investment amount, you multiply it by the growth factor, and then after you get that final result, you multiply it by the tax effect to get your final. With the Roth, you just rearrange things. You take your investment amount, you multiply it by the tax effect to get taxes out of the way, and then you take that result and multiply it by the growth factor to get your final result. But the commutative law of multiplication from grade school says these are the same. It's just A times B times C versus A times C times B. So you say, Eric, that's great. I get it. You have convinced me that traditional and Roth work out the same mathematically. So what difference does it make which I choose? I'll just pick one and move on. But the problem with that is that traditional and Roth only work out the same when the tax rate at time of contribution is exactly the same as the tax rate at time of withdrawal. And I can tell you that is almost assuredly not going to happen. Even if you end up in the same exact tax bracket, there will be differences in the effective tax rate. So it will definitely matter which account type you choose. Now, it's too much to go into all the details in one video, but let me give you one interesting example that shows the difference in effective tax rate even when you end up in the same tax bracket. Let's say you invested in a traditional account years ago, and your tax rate was 22% when you made your contributions. You retire in 2024 and you pull out $130,000 from your traditional account, and that is the only income you have to live on. Of course, you'll have to pay tax on that $130,000 because it came from a traditional account. Now let's put that on hold for now and come back to it. If all things were the same and you had invested in a Roth, you would have paid the 22% tax on your contributions when they went in, so the equivalent withdrawal would be $101,400. The important point there is that you pay the tax on your Roth contributions at your top rate at the time of contribution. So as we said, that was 22%. So with the Roth, you pull out the $101,400 and you pay zero tax on it, which might sound great, but let's return to the traditional to compare. Now, if I put that $130,000 of income into my tax software for married filing joint, it determines that this taxpayer is in the 22% tax bracket. So it matches the tax bracket that the taxpayer was in at time of contribution. And according to Dave, since the taxpayer is in the same tax bracket, the Roth should win, and it should win big. Remember, he said you would have to be in a dramatically lower tax bracket for the traditional to win. According to what I showed you earlier, that the Roth and traditional are mathematically equal, you might think that Roth and traditional should come out the same here. And if this taxpayer's income was all taxed at 22%, you would be right, because $130,000 times 0.22 equals $20,600 in taxes that you would have to pay, and $130,000 minus $20,600 equals $101,400, exactly like the Roth. But remember, I said Roth and traditional are only the same if the actual effective tax rate is the same. In this case, the taxpayer is in the same 22% top marginal tax bracket, but not all of his income will be taxed at 22%. Tax calculations don't work that way. Look here and you'll see that the actual effective tax rate is only 9.45%, and the tax that my software calculates is $12,282, meaning that with the traditional, you would have $130,000 minus $12,282 in taxes, which is equal to $117,718, which is $16,318 more than you had with the Roth. Let's look closer at the tax calcs to confirm this big win for the traditional. So the way the tax is calculated on the $130,000 is as follows. The first $29,200 is taxed at 0% because of the standard deduction. The next $23,200 is taxed at 10% because that is the size of the 10% tax bracket. The next $71,100 is taxed at 12% because that is the size of the 12% tax bracket. And finally, $6,500 is taxed at 22% because that is the part of the $130,000 that remains and falls into the 22% tax bracket. And if you add these all up, you get the $12,282, which is exactly what my tax software computed. So the after-tax amount of the traditional account is confirmed to be $117,718, which confirms the $16,318 win for the traditional account. Before we move on, take note of what's happening here. This taxpayer was able to take income that would have been taxed at his top marginal rate while he was in his earning years, and he was able to transfer it to much lower tax rates at time of withdrawal in retirement. So that $16,318 is a massive win for this particular taxpayer. And this taxpayer was in the same tax bracket at time of contribution as he was in at time of withdrawal. So clearly, Dave is giving some bad advice, at least for taxpayers that are in a similar situation, because that $16,000 win might be repeatable for many years for this taxpayer. And had this taxpayer put all of his retirement into a Roth, this opportunity would have been lost to him. Of course, it's not always the case that traditional wins out. The Roth has unique advantages of its own. You really have to look at your expected scenario and make your decision on those expectations, and not on some talking head who says to go all Roth or all traditional without even knowing the details of your situation. And definitely do not base your decision on the Roth superiority fallacy. It's a non-factor. The Roth is not mathematically superior to the traditional. So I hope this video made it clear what the Roth superiority fallacy is, and that it should not influence your decision making. In future videos, I'll dig into the actual advantages of Roth and the actual advantages of a traditional account. So keep an eye out for those, and to make sure you don't miss out, make sure you click that subscribe button and that notification bell. And if you need help with your taxes, check out my online tax service at webfile.tax. The link is in the description below. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.